Hello everyone, welcome to today's Mayflower 2020 Our Voice talk. I'm Helen Moore, I'm the facilitator for the talk today, and today's talk is from Danny Reilly and Angela Sherlock of the Mayflower Mavericks. This talk has been put together by MOV, the Mayflower 2020 Our Voice Coalition. And I'll just read you a little bit on our Facebook. Mayflower Voice is a coalition of community organisations, art groups and individuals addressing the historical and current issues raised by the Mayflower 400th anniversary and its legacy of colonisation. This talk is part of our joint project Reconciliation, aiming to bring cultural awareness, education and conversation about colonialisation, and to somehow honour the history and perspective of First Nations related to this chapter. Just to let everyone know that you can turn your video off. This is being recorded and then will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you don't want your image public, then you can turn off your video. We're going to have a talk about the Caribbean connection. From the Mayflower Mavericks, which was set up in response to the 400 commemorations that started in 2015. They also have a book and a website, and their website is mayflowermavericks.wordpress.com, which Danny and Angela have put in the message chat, which you can click, and you can buy the book from there. You can also buy the book. It's available in the Mayflower shop on the Barbican, and is their bestseller. It's also available at Waterstones. They have one left, Cosmic Kitchen, and is available at the Plymouth Library as well. So we're going to have a 20-minute talk and then a Q&A. If you've got any questions, you can put them in the Zoom chat, and you can also save them to ask Danny and Angela at the end of the talk. So I'll pass over to Danny and Angela.
You ready?
Yep.
Yep. You can start now.
Okay.
Mayflower. Story or history? We're going to give a brief presentation centered around the 400-year anniversary of the Mayflower sailing in 1620. It's one of the most remembered events in British colonial history, but this is special. And major transatlantic commemorations have been planned that involve history education as part of the events.
But this presentation is taking place now in 2020 against two important contexts. On one side is the reinvigoration of the movement against racism, the Black Lives Movement. These involve increased pressures to decolonize education through all age groups. On the other side are new, highly restrictive government guidelines issued by the Department for Education about what teachers can teach.
And though what we draw attention to might not be well known, one of our points is that neither is it news. Education about colonialism in the UK is restricted, and we're trying to contribute to highlighting these restrictions. The voyage of the Mayflower has been used to create a series of stories regularly repurposed to serve the politics of the day. We've had the story of them as valiant religious refugees.
They weren't.
Who set foot on Plymouth Rock.
They didn't.
And the story that they discovered and tamed a new world.
It wasn't a new world.
The story that they found in America, built on democracy.
So let's take a look at this democracy. In 1969, there was a very successful Broadway musical called 1776, which you will know was the year of the Declaration of Independence that was part of the American Revolution.
This musical was so successful that a film version was made, and one of the songs, Molasses to Rum to Slaves, can be found on YouTube. It's worth looking up. Though the musical is rather, shall we say, dated, this song highlights the important slave trading link between West Africa and the British Caribbean, and the molasses trading and rum refining link between the Caribbean and New England.
So 50 years ago, they were singing about this New England Caribbean link in the cinemas and on Broadway. But today, during the Mayflower 400 commemorations, there is no mention of it.
The mini triangular trade involving New England, West Africa, and the British Caribbean slave colonies was an important source of wealth for the British North American colonies. It is this great wealth which explains why 13 colonies could contemplate rebelling against the most powerful empire at the time, the British Empire.
The telling of the Mayflower story, as opposed to the history, began in 1769 with Forefathers' Day. By then, New England had gone from being a near-failing tiny colony to being a very wealthy group of northeastern American colonies. These New England colonies were part of 13 dissident British colonies. New England merchants traded with the Caribbean and West Africa in such things as molasses, rum, and enslaved Africans. About the same time, Massachusetts was creating both the story of their 150-year roots with the Mayflower story and starting to take a leading part in the protests over the imperial British motherland's colonial taxation, colonial government, and trading policies.
The first US Vice President and second US President, John Adams, wrote to a friend,
I know not why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in American independence. Many great events have proceeded from much smaller causes.
Now, you might want to say that the Caribbean-New England connection is very important for understanding the context for the creation of the Mayflower story.
Or you might want to say it is just a part of the contextualization of the Mayflower story.
But what you shouldn't say is nothing.
Unfortunately, what is being taught about colonial history during the present Mayflower commemorations is selective.
The teaching and publicity focus remains on the Mayflower passengers, particularly the separatist minority, the early colonization in the area that became known as New Plymouth, and the story of how the colony set up by the Mayflower passengers led to the establishment of democracy with the American Revolution.
Now, how does this story come about? The Mayflower was a divided ship, less than half the passengers being Calvinist separatists, and the rest they called strangers. Tradesmen put on board by the ship's financiers. The ship was driven off course and ended up off the coast of what is later called Provincetown Harbour. They were now 3,000 miles from Old England and 250 miles from the mouth of the Hudson. They had no right in English law to be where they were. Within this legally uncertain situation, friction arose between the two factions, with some of the strangers threatening to leave the group and settle on their own.
The Mayflower Covenant, they didn't call it a compact back then, was signed by 41 of the 50 male passengers. The women, of course, had no say. It was not a constitution, but rather an adaptation of a Puritan church covenant. Despite its principle of common consent, in practice, much of the power was guarded by the separatists.
So the first question, how has this covenant come to be claimed as the foundation of democracy in America? What about the Virginia General Assembly of June 1619? It was described as the oldest continuous law-making body in the Western Hemisphere, and with 22 of its burgesses chosen by the free white male inhabitants of the colony, has some claim to allowing settlers to participate in their own government. But Jamestown is not a good look. The colony, founded in 1607, with its assembly predating the Mayflower Covenant, nearly collapsed amidst war with indigenous nations in the area and is alleged to have resorted to cannibalism, which does not ride comfortably alongside democratic representation.
Second question, when was the Mayflower Covenant renamed as a compact? Remember what we said about serving the politics of the day? They started calling it that in the 1790s, when the 13 states of the post-revolution new USA were just as divided as the Mayflower passengers had been. Those backing the new constitution of the 13 states were opposed by anti-federalists. Those who feared the influence of the French Revolution warned against too much democracy. The original document had been forgotten until James Wilson unearthed a copy in 1791. He used it to give a lecture justifying the new US Constitution and attacking the anti-federalists. So the rebranded Mayflower Compact that's being taught today in Plymouth schools uses the story created by the Federalist wing. John Quincy Adams promoted this story about the Mayflower Compact in a famous speech in 1802 when anti-federalist Jefferson was president. Remember, this new America is supposed to be about democracy, self-governance. Well, that's the same President Jefferson who imposed 32 treaties on various indigenous nations in order to take some 200,000 square miles of their territory to sell to speculators, small farmers, and slave owners.
Some writers claim to see in the wording of the original covenant new indications for creating democratic association in the future. But others point out the similarity it had to agreements in common use in England in the 17th century for regulating social arrangements. Also, the agreement signed then did not lead to representative democracy in the new colony. Not being part of the congregation limited having a say about who ruled the colony. The actual forms of governance adopted in the New England colonies were similar to that of regional rule by local elites in the towns of England.
This is important because the controversial character of the John Quincy Adams interpretation of the renamed Mayflower Compact is the only one presented to students to discuss. More importantly, this lack of historical background about the divided political situation in the new USA at the turn of the 19th century is usually coupled with little or no examination of what democracy actually did exist there then.
The USA in the 1790s was hardly more democratic than Britain or its colonies in the Caribbean, India, Australia, and elsewhere. Slave work, slave ownership, and slave trading in North America were imposed on the people of African heritage in the newly formed states. Also, plantation slavery was soon expanded in the south of the USA. The number of African Americans and European Americans was totaled to calculate voting allocations in the electoral colleges of these states, but without giving the slaves the vote.
The people of indigenous nations, already subject to onslaughts of land seizure, war, or malnutrition, now face the beginnings of an escalation in attacks and genocidal forced removal.
This historical context for discussing actual democratic association is not planned as part of the Mayflower Compact studies. Such sanitized education seems to be the order of the day during these commemorations.
What is left out is, firstly, the fact that the Covenant of 1620, designed to stop the colonists falling out, was rebranded as the Mayflower Compact in the 1790s in order to defeat the anti-federalists. And secondly, at the turn of the 19th century, the USA, like the British Empire, was a society based on slavery and genocidal land grabbing and not democracy.
Here's a few points it might be useful to include on a future Mayflower education timeline.
1637, you know the myth of Thanksgiving and how the Pilgrims invented it. It's alleged that the Massachusetts and Connecticut colonists' Thanksgiving for this year was to celebrate the slaughter of 700 unarmed Pequot men, women, and children.
1645. The famous Mayflower pilgrim Edward Winslow opposed the proposal to establish religious freedoms in Plymouth, Massachusetts. 15 years later, colonists were hanging Quakers in Boston.
1654, Jamaica. This always gets left out of the story, what Edward Winslow was doing there. The same Edward Winslow was appointed by the ruler of Britain, fellow Puritan Oliver Cromwell, to be head civilian commissioner on the British invasion fleet, that went on to take Jamaica. Winslow died in 1655 on board a ship sailing to take Jamaica, following the British defeat by the Spanish colonists on the island of Hispaniola.
1741. We've all heard about Plymouth Rock.
And the little girl who stepped on it first.
And the
yes.
first little girl to step on it. 121 years after the Mayflower journey, 94-year-old Thomas Faunce claimed his father was told by settlers in 1723 that they had been told by pilgrims that this was the rock they first stepped on. It is never mentioned in any of the pilgrims' writings as far as we know, and there doesn't appear to be any historical evidence for it, despite its great fame.
Yes, I think we've even got we had a model of it in Plymouth. I don't know where it's gone.
No, it was in the square.
Yeah. 1756 to 63. This is the 7 Years' War. This important worldwide war was actually begun in 1754, and the part fought in North America is often known as the French and Indian War. The North American part of this British victory resulted in the colonial limitations and taxations the British imposed on its American colonists, which led to the events culminating in the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
1820. Daniel Webster, the US Secretary of State, invented the term Pilgrim Fathers. That's 200 years after the Mayflower arrival, and it's now in common usage to describe the passengers. Also, in his 200-year Mayflower anniversary speech, Webster spoke of the people of the indigenous nations as savages and roving barbarians.
1861 to 65 was the American Civil War. Now, in the midst of this war, first of all, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln inaugurated Thanksgiving Day in gratitude for the pivotal victory of the Union Army at Gettysburg. Secondly, shortly before this announcement, following a brief but bloody war with the Dakota tribe in the state of Minnesota, 38 Dakota were executed, the largest mass execution in US history.
This was in turn followed by a law which nullified the treaties with the tribes in the state of Minnesota, and another which granted presidential authority without treaty or negotiation to remove the tribes from the state of Minnesota. This brutal removal led to the creation of the Crow Creek Reservation, which was unsustainable for the number of people sent there and resulted in the deaths of many Dakota and Winnebago people.
The legend is that British colonization in the Americas and the independent state that came out of that was built on democracy. We do not think that the indigenous nations and the African American slaves would agree. As Malcolm X famously said, we did not land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. So this might be a good time to open up discussion and questions for about 20 minutes or so.
If that's all right, Helen. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So we're going to open up now to questions from people. So if anyone would like to either let me know they want to ask a question or write a question in the group chat, or you can also raise your hand, like the little mechanical hand. I think I'm going to start by asking about your work with activism and education, and kind of why you feel it's so important to do that in Plymouth, and especially around the Mayflower.
Shall I go? Yeah. Well, as people may know, the centre in the UK for the Mayflower commemorations, the 400th anniversary commemorations, is Plymouth. There are 11, or at least 11 centres around England where there are commemorations taking place, and where various activities and events are taking place. But with Plymouth being the central one, the key one, it's very important to challenge that. And in 2000, to challenge the lack of clear education, which tells the whole of the story, where it doesn't leave out the Caribbean connections with New England, where it doesn't, where the background to the story about democracy and the Mayflower Compact is told in full, where the what happened as a consequence to the indigenous nations and on the immediate arrival and for 300 years thereafter, in terms of land grabbing and massacres and disease and the promotion of lack of food, which led to malnutrition and large scale death, and that not been brought out but rather, well, it's more the story of.
It's always the story of the passengers, of these valiant religious refugees. If you go into the new museum, the box, there is a very large Mayflower exhibition. I don't know if anybody's been in there. And the curator, Joe Loosemore, worked very hard to try and give more balance. But when I've been in there, little girl said to me the other day, "We did this in school." And I think all she meant was dressing up and what it would be like to be on a ship. And that's the focus that they have been promoting through secondary education as well, isn't it?
Yes.
The dressing up seems to be what you're supposed to do. The only reason they haven't got them dressing up in the museum is because of COVID and infection on clothes.
Yeah, so you feel that they kind of concentrate on the kind of palatable aspects of history rather than going into
The old Mayflower Museum, I don't know if you were ever in there, they had a problem because they don't have any artifacts. So there are lots of boards which left out lots, left out lots of information. When the Black Lives Matter exploded a few months ago, the museum was closed so that they had to go through their boards and just make sure they said a little bit more than they had been saying before.
Yeah, and I think there is that. Sorry.
In 2015, they opened the Mayflower Museum down on the Barbican, and it's there that lots of people, when they saw the sanitized education that was being displayed there, and therefore, and it soon became evident when they started up a website that this was going to be mirrored in their education materials that they started producing. And people have protested, and some people have managed to improve this situation over the last 5 years. And it's been hard work, but frankly, it is still far from satisfactory, very far. What you have is a major UK-wide history commemoration, probably one of the largest in our lifetimes, and there are huge holes in it, and there is a sanitization of which we're very familiar with, but where colonization is not talked about in its full extent and is marginalized in our schools.
Yeah, I think it's really important to mention for people who aren't familiar with your activism and the work that you do, that you have actually been doing this for 5 years, a lot longer than just a lot of people who are coming across the Mayflower 400 this year and last year would realise. And a lot of your work is about filling up those gaps in our own education and knowledge in school, where it's an important place to start learning this information.
Well, to be honest, Helen, we tried, along with many other people, including yourself, to do that. But we have to admit that the impact has not been what we would have hoped for. But we need to persevere in this. It's very important, and I think those that have persevered, and some of you are here this evening, I'm pleased to see. have had some successes, and they should be. Angela has mentioned Joe Loosemore in the box has done some work, but there are others that people have probably stood on the Hoe and seen an art installation which by the Speedwell people.
Still moving.
Still
yes.
moving, yes, which I think has had an impact as well. And these are hopefully having a cumulative effect and improving somewhat what is going on during these commemorations.
Sorry, I would say that art piece has been really interesting actually, because I see a lot of people talking about it and discussing it, and it's not something that you can miss on the city when you're looking out. I just wanted to read out a few of the bits in the chat box to you. So Lauren and Glenn say it's a very moving talk. Aniada has a question, and she asks, what do you think decolonizing means?
Well, basically, it means teaching about colonialism. In the context that we're talking about, it means teaching about colonialism. And what we've had a media campaign to brand decolonizing education, where we actually are trying to add topics into the curriculum.
You say it's taking away history. When they take down statues or rename squares or object, you're removing something from our history instead of, but that the opposite is what we're trying to do.
Yes, we're trying to add. So what you've had a very clever play on words where adding has been portrayed as subtracting, where we're trying to add that you should actually be teaching about what happened in North America over the last 400 years. You should be teaching about what happened in the Caribbean over the last 400 years as a matter of course in our schools. And because this isn't happening, lots of people do not appreciate or understand the Black Lives Matter movement, why people are so angry that now we have the continuation of institutionalized racism in this country. And they don't appreciate it because basically the colonization and the history that it is not, and the literature and other subjects as well,
yes,
are just not been taught as tradition, going back to when public education, but back to the 1870s when public education started as something that all children had to have.
Now, there has been a movement, there is a growing movement in the National Education Union and the TUC to decolonize. And at the same time, government has issued diktats, the Department for Education, that you mustn't teach anti-capitalism. Well, I think decolonization is also about anti-capitalism, because that's what it arose from, merchant venturism.
Mm-hmm. I don't know whether everybody is aware about these new guidelines that have been issued about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, by the Department for Education, which are very, very worrying. It's a very, very new departure that a government should come out. The legal status of these instructions is questionable, but who in the present climate is going to be able to take the matter to court and challenge this? But it is very worrying to what extent they're going to be used to block people talking about colonialism to our students.
Yeah, I was really confused when I heard that they didn't want anti-capitalist teaching, because I was kind of trying to work out what exactly did they mean by that, and also does that affect all like different types of philosophy that aren't necessarily and how do they put all this into a category? What does it mean for teaching and teaching fully, you know?
Well, it seems to be very, very woolly, very, very unclear. Therefore, people who simply want to teach about colonialism and the growth of the profit motive, which lay behind mass enslavement and invasion and land grabbing, are they to be sort of controlled and censored? Teachers who want to do this, and there are many teachers who do. What does these new guidelines mean for them? It is extremely ambiguous and extremely worrying.
And I feel it's very directly in result to the response to Black Lives Matter. It's about the timing is about bits, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It does.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people actually as well, because of the lack of that in our education, they don't realise that there is that connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and where that originates from and how it connects with the Mayflower and that kind of thing. They think it's all just being added on rather than realising about the Caribbean and that kind of thing. But
yes, it tends to be, it happens in America and not here, which is not true.
Yeah, I really wanted to ask, do you, a lot of people when they hear this and they hear people, responses in Plymouth that I've come across before, why are you talking about this in the UK when it's an American issue?
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any kind of response to that.
Well, if you go back, yes, if you go back to some of the earlier pamphlets in the 60s and 70s that were published in Britain by various by Bernard Cord, the famous How the West Indian Child Was Made Educationally Subnormal, which used to be a categorization in the English school system, was published in 1971, and there's been a Black history movement as old as 60 years. People have been campaigning. Many from the Black community have been campaigning to have history, the history of the Caribbean, the history of the Indian subcontinent, in much more to the fore in the history of Britain, because just as you can't understand the history of, say, Jamaica without the history of Britain, you can't understand the history of Britain without having the history of Jamaica, because of the real importance that Jamaica had, both for Britain and its wealth growth, and actually for its American colonies, North American colonies, because it made a very important contribution because of the enslavement and the sugar production that took place in Barbados and Jamaica and elsewhere. And it has a direct bearing on what happened in North America. Yeah.
I just wanted to take a question from the Zoom chat from Jenny. She asks, where can we find these new educational guidelines?
Well,
it's just been announced, hasn't it? We in the press.
But it's actually on the website. It's on the DFE website. Yeah. It takes a bit of hunting down, but people have tweeted them. They've copied them and put them out on social media. But it took me, I'm a bit slow on these matters, but I actually, by hunting around, I did find it on the DFE website, these guidelines. They're there.
I have to say, when I was teaching, I never once referred to the Department for Education for guidance on what happened in my classroom.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bit odd, but you have written some guidelines for schools to use, like suggestions, haven't you, for the curriculum?
Well, yes. Part of our motivation has been to try to influence and alter and to fill in the gaps that have been made by the educational aspects of the commemorations. We've written many things. We've spoken. We published a book. Maybe I put the title of the book in the chat box.
I'm going to wave it
I'm
around.
going to wave it around if that's all right.
Fine.
It's published by the Socialist History Society, which I suppose gives you an insight into to our politics. But basically, it was intended to have several purposes, and one was to actually provide suggestions for what to teach, bibliographical reference. It's got a timeline, just so that people. It isn't the answer. It isn't meant to be the answer. But I'd also like to draw attention to the fact that others have done this, similar things. It's very little known, but there's a school, a very small little school up in Lincolnshire, which is one of the centres of the Mayflower 400 commemorations. And one of the teachers in this school, St. Helena's Church of England School, that he got together with some of his pupils at the school, and they wrote a book about the Mayflower 400. They called it Celebrating the Mayflower 400, 1620 to 2020. But in the corner of their cover, they've got, but what about the Native Americans? And it is, and if you think this has been produced, I can't know whether you can see this book, yeah?
Yeah.
And if they can do it, this little school in Lincolnshire, no, I'm not saying that it's the greatest book ever, but they've actually gone out of their way to actually educate their students, both in the traditional way and in the challenging way, to present to them, which is a lesson that we could learn, that if a small little school like that can do it, why can't a commemoration with lots and lots more money than them do something like this, rather than what they are doing?
Yeah. I just wanted to say someone's helpfully linked to an article about schools told not to use anti-capitalist material in teaching. Thank you, Joe. Laurie says, why teach colonisation? George Santanian's, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, which is very true. And Jenny says, very informative book. Thanks for writing it and drawing attention. Have been passing information and writing stories myself to tell others, which is really good. I think personally, I would say that this is a great book to get if you want to understand the timeline and the Caribbean connection. I just want to open it up to questions again. Q&A, if anyone wants to ask a question themselves. Or write one in the chat box, please feel free to do that. And we're very lucky to have Angela and Danny here to chat with us and to help us kind of understand the issue. And I know that they've been active activists with this for 5 years or more, and they're teachers and understand how important it is to teach. How do you feel in general that they're dealing with the anniversary here in Plymouth during this time, the 400th anniversary?
They started out very much intent on just telling one story. We were told that you can only tell one story, and I think that has been dented. I think pressure from all of you, all of us, has made them broaden it out. And particularly Jo's exhibition in the Mayflower is, I think she uses the term legend and legacy. So she's a part of it. She's very much concerned to have the stories of the people who were affected by it. She's put them largely up front there. And I don't think it was always very easy for her to do that. I think she was fighting, wasn't she?
I think a number of people have taken different approaches to try to improve the situation. Some people have used art Some people have used exhibitions. There isn't one way. People have tried to coordinate in challenging this, but one of the things that I think is most worrying is that there seems to be they're going to persevere, it looks like, with this idea of getting the students in Plymouth to look at the Mayflower Compact when discussing democratic representation. And in order to do that, they've got to, they're basically not telling the full story about this document, which has been rebranded as the Mayflower Compact, this covenant that we spoke about. And it is very worrying if they do persevere with this. There was planned this year to have a big assembly of school representatives to produce what they were going to call a Plymouth Compact. Now, the idea of teaching about democracy and democratic representation is a very good one. To teach students that they should come up with ideas for how to improve our democracy within our society is a very good one. However, because they are trying to link it, yes, you're quite right, but because they're trying to link it to this Mayflower Compact idea and the misleading traditional history, which goes back to what you were saying about the 1802 speech of John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, and he himself was the 6th president of the United States of America. This famous speech is not history, it's his, and is presented as such rather than his point of view about what was going on and what the covenant that was produced in 1620 meant. And this is getting promoted, or is still planned to be promoted. It's still on the Mayflower 400 website, and it's very, very worrying. Is this going to go ahead? It looks like it, now that events have started up again. And I think it's one of the things that I would like to see, well, looked at again by the Mayflower 400 people, looked again by the local authority, and looked again by us all, so that we can actually present a more contextualized account of democracy and the history of the Mayflower.
Yeah, and I find it kind of worrying now that I've moved to Plymouth. I learnt about Mayflower 400, and I've met you and lots of people, and just actually realizing how many gaps in our history that we're missing in our teaching at school. And it's not just about Mayflower. I found it when I've been learning about Ireland and the troubles in Ireland, and there seems to be aspects of history in school which are kind of cut out, left, because they're not so they don't paint us in the best light, which is strange. I feel like it shouldn't be like that. I mean, that's, I'm broadening it a little bit there, but from Aniada says, what is Mayflower 400's board response to all of this?
Well, I mean, we are trying to persevere with trying to get the narrative changed. In particular, the one, as I mentioned, about this project for bringing the Mayflower Compact so centrally into the education, without clarifying what the Mayflower Compact was and its history, because the democracy in the 1790s in the United States of America was slavery is not democratic. Developing policies and programs of removal, which happened in the late 18th and first half of the 19th century, in which were decimating indigenous people in the Americas. This is not democratic. And this was what was happening. The extension of slavery, the extension of removal policies, the extension of killing as a consequence of these removal policies. And this needs to be the context in which people consider democracy. When you look back on Britain at this time, Britain was linked to its slave colonies, and the slave colonies in the Caribbean, for instance, were there was a lobby called the West Indian Lobby, who were also part of the corrupt rotten boroughs situation that was obtaining in Britain. The mixing up of slavery, colonialism, and corruption in Britain needs to be brought out more, and this we hope to do in future, because I think there is a crying need for it, to make these associations. People in Bristol, I know, have been doing this to very good effect, actually.
All their plans were derailed in 2020. Lots of them were, but they are still pushing on. So we will still push on, and it needs that compact, all the kids to be up on the stage in the Theatre Royal with their, this is democracy and this is the Plymouth Compact. It's shameful. It probably will be happening next year now rather than this year. I think everything that was shelved for this current year will be coming back. But that will also depend on the virus.
Yeah. We've got a question from Stephanie Pratt. Might have to accept my unmuting.
Is it working?
Yeah, I can hear you.
It's not really a question. I mean, thank you, Danny and Angela, for really a very clear discussion about what is the real history, and it's kind of complicated. But I think Adriana asked about the Mayflower 400 board. So I was going to just say about what I know about it. And all I can say is that it's going to take pressure, maybe not just from Mayflower Mavericks, but from people in Plymouth, to change that Mayflower Compact, whatever it's called, teaching, because they asked me as an advisor on their website. So I was asked to consult on their website, and I told them that they needed to change that Mayflower Compact, that the whole thing was wrong historically. It needed to be clearly contextualized, et cetera, et cetera. And they haven't got back to me, and they haven't changed it. So it's not really the voice of maybe one or two people. It's going to take teachers, educators, business leaders. I mean, it's a big thing to actually force that board to change what they're doing, you know. I mean, if Plymouthians are not happy with it, they need to make that clear, that, you know, they don't think it's acceptable, these parts of the website, because it is a portrayal of Plymouth. It's a portrayal of your own history, where you are as a society there. And yes, it's made some great strides ahead by adding Wampanoag stories and wampum stories. So those of you who've gone on it and looked at it, you've seen these things, but the Mayflower Compact sits there, as does all the teaching aids, the teachers' toolkits, which have never been altered. So, you know, if you're an educationalist, you will know, and you will know what those kind of things look like. All I can say is I live in Exeter, so, you know, I'm kind of in a way distanced from all this, but I've been the one that's been, you know, given some access. And so I feel the big responsibility of, you know, setting them straight, but they're not listening. So I think that's what I would say where we are right now. So I hope that's helpful. And thank you again, everybody. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm going to have to go, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank
I'd
you.
like to say thank you to Steph for clarifying that, because yeah, that was really, really helpful. Really, really helpful contribution. Very helpful. Thank you. Wish I'd said it.
Jenny says as well, we leave out great chunks of truths about indigenous peoples in other countries as well. It seems to be part of how we teach. Have you got any kind of advice for places where people can find out more information if they're interested?
Well, I see that Jenny specifically mentions the Australian Aboriginal people. I mean, what happened in 1768 was that Cook left Plymouth to go in one of his most famous voyage, where he ends up, in quotes, discovering Australia and claiming it for Britain. And there was one talk back in 2018 in Plymouth that was organised to mark that occasion, and unfortunately it did not go in and clarify the consequences of that journey, because after Cook had claimed Australia for Britain, there was a gap of 8 years before the British returned to fully conquer and colonize Australia and New Zealand as well, with devastating consequences for the population of both of those places. And that really needs to be dealt with. There is in the new box a placard which does have a sentence which explains and clarifies Cook's journey, but much more needs to be done in relation to Australia.
Just a sentence, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. What does it say?
I can't remember, but I know they took a very close look when Black Lives Matter happened. They went back and took a close look at what they were saying around all their exhibits, because you've got Hawkins in there, you've got Drake, both slavers, and then you've got Cook, and you go through that whole gallery.
Yeah, there are websites which I look at to do with Australia, but if we come back to Plymouth and Australia, if you go down to the Barbican, and if you walk up the hill from the pub called the Admiral McBride, there is a series of placards there about Australia, just about people who've been to Australia, about associations, and none of them address the issue. I mean, what they say is fine, but none of them are set against the consequences of British colonization in Australia. And we need to remember that it was the late 1960s when indigenous Aboriginal Australians were even acknowledged as citizens in the country. And there has been, as there have been in the Americas, there's been a movement in Australia to campaign for rights of the Aboriginal peoples, and for an end to the discrimination and the ill health and the suffering of the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, which is something that Plymouth, there is an association, there is a connection here, and even if there wasn't, there is a British connection, a very direct British connection that we should acknowledge and talk about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think
Rio Tinto zinc has just desecrated. They're mining, and so they've taken, as they were doing in the Americas, they've taken land, they've destroyed, like Turtle Island, they were taking that in America. They've destroyed sacred lands. The Aboriginal peoples are not supposed to own them anymore. They're still fighting for their rights. And this goes back to way, way back to the 15th century, when the popes of Europe, merchant capitalism was rising and they needed expansion, and so the popes gave all the crowned heads of Europe the right to go out and take land anywhere, to steal the whole world. And they described the land they went to, and later it was Australia, the Americas and Africa, as terra nullius, empty land, because the people who were in it were not Christian, therefore they were not human. And that is not so far from the attitude now.
That reminds me a little bit of the paper bulls that you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So that, would you be able to talk about that a little bit?
Well, there's a series of them. That they basically gave rights to the heads of the countries in Europe, who were all male, I think, at that time. They were allowed, you can have the West Coast, Portugal, you can have the West Coast of Africa, and you can enslave there in perpetuity. And you can have Spain was granted somewhere else. And they just gave away these lands. And the people in them didn't count, the civilizations didn't count, and for Rio Tinto in Australia, the civilizations still don't count, because they were expanding, because they wanted profits, again, which is a thread in the Mayflower. The English, I mean, Mayflower comes from a king's patent rather than the Pope, and that's Jamestown and so on up to the Hudson, where they shouldn't have ended up. And it's still, I think I've talked about this before, in 2005, this is still in law, the doctrine of discovery in America. It's in the legal system, and it's filtered into many of the other countries like Australia. But in 2005, some native Indians in America were trying to claim their land, and they couldn't, and it was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg who said, this is the law, the land doesn't belong to you, and it still stands 500 years later, which is incredibly shocking. How you create law and maintain it. So the doctrine of discovery still filters all the way through. And though that didn't apply to the colonization of Australia, the same doctrines filtered in, the same attitude, the same land grabbing.
Yeah.
In Australia, they tend to talk in terms, the Aboriginal people tend to talk of stolen children, stolen wages, stolen land, rather than the terms used in other centers of colonization, such as North America. They use the word stolen, but the phenomena is similar, so that you never had slavery, formal slavery of the Aboriginal peoples, but people were made to work for nothing often, because the wages weren't forthcoming. There is a whole history in Australia which also needs to come to the fore as part of all this. And there is new scholarship, new writings that are coming out about the Indian subcontinent and about the British Empire, which people may be aware of. There was Primavado Gopal's book called Insurgent Empire is worth a read. It's a very, very good book and covers all sorts of different countries and about the resistance in Britain itself from those people from the Indian subcontinent and from Africa that came to live in Britain and activated people here as well. and these overlapping, intertwined histories. It's really important to know that the history of Britain is also the history of it's fed as part of those histories.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to know that with your work, whenever you do a talk, you always relate it to the present moment. And that is why the history is so important, to put the present moment into context for people. Because I think a lot of people don't realize as well how not that very long ago, indigenous people still didn't have that many rights, and still don't, and are still fighting about issues around the land, and pipes being put through people's lands, people's water not being drinkable, and people still being pushed around on the land. So it's
in America to vote, you can queue for 11 hours to vote, because in certain areas where they have, black population, there are fewer polling booths, and you can queue 5 hours for 11 hours. It's absolutely incredible in 2020 that that's still happening. And you can demand photo ID in all sorts of ways for taking the vote away, for disenfranchising them. It's a bit difficult, actually. That something positive.
Is there anything that you would like to end on? Because I think we've come to the end of the talk. And please do, talk about your website and your book as well. And
I'd like to draw attention to the fact that there are many groups out there that are doing excellent work, Black educators and others who are doing excellent work in promoting decolonization of the curriculum. And though many they're not possibly as strong in Plymouth as we would like, they are around, and it is possible to contact them. There was an excellent talk by a group the other day that I went to. You'll forgive me, I can't remember the I'm sorry, I can't remember his second name. And there are things happening, particularly in the London area, in the Birmingham area. People are getting things together, and I think we need to look to coordinating them. And I think it is the responsibility, which has been appreciated much more, of the trade union movement, which is representative of the ordinary people, that they are much more. Following the Congress of the TUC a few weeks ago, they passed new, more activating policy that people will become involved, and we're hoping that that leads to the trade union movement taking a much more prominent role in campaigning over education about colonialism, so that people understand why we are so concerned about Black Lives Matter. Because the thing is that if they don't matter in the history of our society, then that is a license for them not to matter in other aspects of our society, namely the legal and in the discrimination that they have to have and have had to face for decades now. And it's time that it comes to an end. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Angela, do you have anything that you'd like to say?
No, I think he was really good, actually.
Pretty good, I'll be honest. So thank you so much for coming and taking the time to talk to us. Your website, if people are interested, which has got a lot of information on it as well that you've spoken about tonight, is mayflowermavericks.wordpress.com. It's linked at the start of the message chat if anyone would like to do that. And your book as well, Telling the Mayflower Story, Thanksgiving or Land Grabbing, Massacres and Slavery, by Danny Reilly and Steve Cushion. That is a really good book. I highly recommend that you get hold of it. And it's £4, so And that's available at the Barbican, Mayflower Shop, Waterstones, Cosmic Kitchen, and Plymouth Library. So thank you so much. I'll just let everyone know if they're interested. We've got another event coming on the 22nd of November, our next event, and that will be a creative session rather than a talk and Q&A. And that will be about rethinking Thanksgiving with Indigenous artist Melinda Schwalkhofer. I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to the Mayflower 2020 Our Voice Facebook page. And if you go to the event as well that this was for, the Facebook event, there's a link to the Mayflower website in the discussion part of it. So thank you so much to everyone who came today. Really appreciate your questions and your links. Annie has shared a link to political organisation diversity in Devon, which is North Devon Sunrise, which sounds interesting. I will have a look at that myself. And yes, thank you to Danny and Angela from Mayflower Mavericks.
Thank you, Helen, as well.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mayflower 2020 Our Voice.
Yes, MOV 2020, Our Voice. See what we can continue to do.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.